A clawed carcass lay on the trail, its flesh torn open as if by something monstrous. The smell of blood was overpowering, and the low rumble in the distance wasn't thunder. It was closer than you dared to believe. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Tom Wilkins zipped up his camouflage jacket, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. The familiar weight of his rifle rested comfortably in his hands as he surveyed the dense Adirondack forest before him. At 58, the retired firefighter from Albany still felt a thrill every time he ventured into the wilderness for deer season. "You sure you don't want company out there, Tom?" His hunting buddy Mike called from the cabin porch. "These old bones of mine could use another day of rest, but I'll drag myself out there if you need me." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I'll be fine. You know I prefer the solitude. Besides, someone's got to stay behind and make sure the beer stays cold." Mike raised his coffee mug in a mock salute. "Aye, aye, Captain. Just don't forget your radio this time. And for Pete's sake, be careful out there. Ruth'll have my hide if I let anything happen to you." "Yes, Mom." Tom rolled his eyes good-naturedly. He patted the pocket where his handheld radio sat, then shouldered his backpack. "I'll check in every couple of hours. Try not to burn the cabin down while I'm gone." With a final wave, Tom set off into the woods, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. The forest was awash in hues of red, orange, and gold, a painter's palette come to life. As he trekked deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After about an hour of hiking, Tom paused to catch his breath and get his bearings. He pulled out his map, double-checking his planned route to the spot where he'd set up his deer stand last season. The crisp autumn air bit at his face, invigorating him. As he studied the map, a faint scent caught his attention. Tom's nose twitched, trying to identify it. Musky, wild, unlike anything he'd encountered before. A shiver ran down his spine, though he couldn't say why. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he tucked the map away and continued on. The forest seemed to grow denser as he pressed forward, the trees closing in around him. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Tom's senses were on high alert, years of hunting experience kicking in as he moved as quietly as possible through the underbrush. Snap! The sudden sound of a twig breaking behind him made Tom's heart race. He whirled around, rifle at the ready, only to see a bushy-tailed squirrel darting up a nearby tree. Tom let out a shaky laugh, lowering his weapon. "Get a grip, old man," he muttered to himself. "You're jumping at shadows now." Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. Tom pressed on, keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. After another half hour of hiking, he finally reached the small clearing where he planned to set up his deer bait station. Tom set to work efficiently, years of practice guiding his movements. He scattered corn and apples in a wide arc, then hung a salt lick from a low-hanging branch. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, he'd pause, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "You're getting paranoid in your old age, Tommy," he chided himself. But the prickle at the back of his neck persisted. With the bait station set up, Tom turned his attention to finding a suitable tree for his stand. He circled the clearing, evaluating each potential spot. Finally, he settled on a sturdy oak with a good view of the entire area. As Tom began to secure his tree stand, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest took on an ethereal quality in the fading light, beautiful yet somehow menacing. Shapes seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision, but every time Tom turned to look, there was nothing there. "All right, that should do it," Tom muttered, giving the stand a final shake to ensure its stability. He glanced at his watch, surprised to see how late it had gotten. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Tom settled into his stand, rifle across his lap, and prepared for a long wait. He knew the chances of spotting a deer this late in the day were slim, but he wanted to get a feel for the area before the real hunt began tomorrow. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with night sounds. An owl hooted in the distance and small creatures rustled in the underbrush. Tom's eyes strained to pierce the gloom, his other senses heightened in the darkness. That's when he caught it again, that musky, wild scent from earlier. Stronger this time, unmistakable. Tom's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was out there, something big. A twig snapped, much closer this time. Tom held his breath, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. His mind raced through the possibilities: deer, coyote, maybe even a moose. But deep down, he knew it was something else. The bushes at the edge of the clearing rustled, and Tom raised his rifle, peering through the scope. For a moment, all was still. Then a massive black shape emerged from the shadows, and Tom's blood ran cold. A bear. Not just any bear, but the biggest black bear Tom had ever seen. It lumbered into the clearing, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. The bear's head swung from side to side, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the bait. Tom's finger hovered over the trigger, but he hesitated. Bear season was closed, and he had no permit. Besides, shooting at night was both illegal and dangerous. All he could do was watch and pray the bear didn't notice him. The bear approached the bait pile, snuffling at the scattered corn and apples. It stood up on its hind legs, reaching for the salt lick, and Tom's breath caught in his throat. The animal was enormous, easily 7 feet tall when standing. As if sensing his gaze, the bear suddenly turned its head, its beady eyes locking onto Tom's position. For a heart-stopping moment, hunter and hunted stared at each other, frozen in a tableau of primal fear. Tom's mind raced, recalling every bit of bear safety information he'd ever learned. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Make noise. But perched in his tree stand, his options were limited. The bear dropped back to all fours, taking a step towards Tom's tree. Then another. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth capable of crushing bone. For the first time in his life, Tom felt like prey. His hands shook as he tried to quietly reach for his radio, praying he could call for help without provoking the bear. But as he shifted his weight, the stand creaked loudly in the still night air. The bear's head snapped up at the sound, its eyes gleaming with predatory interest. It let out a low, rumbling growl that Tom felt in his very bones. In that moment, Tom knew he had only one option. With a desperate lunge, he grabbed the nearest branch and began to climb higher, abandoning his rifle and backpack in the stand. As he scrambled up the tree, bark scraping his hands, Tom could hear the bear below, its heavy breathing punctuated by the sound of claws scraping against wood. He climbed higher and higher, not daring to look down, branches whipping at his face. Finally, he reached a spot where the branches were too thin to support the bear's weight. Tom clung to the trunk, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might give away his position. Below, the bear circled the base of the tree, occasionally standing up to peer into the branches. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of his situation set in. Tom was trapped, with no weapon, no supplies, and a hungry predator waiting below. The night stretched before him, long and dark and full of terrors. All he could do was hold on and pray for dawn. The hunt, it seemed, had only just begun. The night seemed endless as Tom clung to his perch high in the oak tree. Every rustle below sent a fresh wave of panic through him, imagining the bear's return. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Tom's muscles screamed in protest from hours of tension. He peered down through the branches, straining to see any sign of the bear. The forest floor lay quiet and still in the pre-dawn gloom. After several minutes of silence, Tom decided to risk climbing down to retrieve his gear. Slowly, painfully, he began his descent. Each creak of a branch made him freeze, listening intently for any sound of the bear's return. Finally, his feet touched the familiar metal of his tree stand. Tom let out a shaky breath, reaching for his abandoned rifle. As his hand closed around the weapon, a low growl froze the blood in his veins. Tom's head snapped up, and he found himself staring into the dark eyes of the massive black bear. It stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the underbrush, but its gaze was fixed squarely on Tom. Oh God, Tom whispered, his mouth dry with fear. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and it took a step forward. Tom's mind raced, trying to remember everything he knew about bear encounters. "Hey, bear," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "I see you there. I'm just gonna back away nice and slow, okay?" The bear tilted its head, seeming almost curious. It sniffed the air, its powerful muscles rippling under its thick fur as it took another step into the clearing. Tom slowly raised his rifle, not to aim, but to appear larger. "I don't want any trouble, big guy," he said, fighting to keep the tremor out of his voice. "There's plenty of food here for both of us. Why don't you help yourself to those apples over there, and I'll just be on my way?" For a moment it seemed like the bear might lose interest. It ambled over to the scattered bait, snuffling at an apple. Tom began to edge away from his tree stand, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. But then the wind shifted, carrying Tom's scent directly to the bear. Its head snapped up, nostrils flaring. The curious look in its eyes hardened into something predatory. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over Tom. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, and Tom felt like prey for the first time in his life. His hands shook as he tried to quietly disengage the safety on his rifle, praying he wouldn't have to use it. "Easy now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's not do anything we'll both regret." The bear dropped back to all fours and began to advance, its eyes never leaving Tom. Each step brought it closer, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the soft forest floor. Tom's back hit a tree trunk and he realized with a jolt of terror that he had run out of room to retreat. The bear was barely 10 feet away now, close enough that Tom could smell its musky odor and see the bits of fur and forest debris caught in its claws. In that moment, Tom made a split-second decision. With a burst of adrenaline, he lunged for the lowest branch of the tree behind him, scrambling to pull himself up. The bear charged. Tom felt a searing pain shoot through his leg as the bear's jaws clamped down, nearly pulling him from his perch. He bit his lip hard enough to draw blood, stifling a scream. Any noise he knew could provoke the bear further. With strength born of desperation, Tom kicked out with his free leg, his boot connecting solidly with the bear's snout. The animal let out a surprised grunt and released its grip, giving Tom just enough time to haul himself higher into the tree. Blood dripped from the torn fabric of his pants leg as Tom climbed, leaving a trail on the bark below. The branch he clung to creaked ominously under his weight, and he pulled himself higher still, ignoring the burning in his muscles and the throbbing pain in his injured leg. Below, the bear circled the base of the tree, occasionally standing on its hind legs to peer up at Tom with curious, hungry eyes. Its powerful claws left deep gouges in the trunk as it tested its ability to climb. Come on," Tom muttered, fumbling for his radio with one hand while clinging to the tree with the other. But as he pulled the device from his pocket, his bloodied finger slipped, and the radio tumbled to the ground below. Tom watched in dismay as the bear sniffed at the fallen radio, then casually swatted it aside with one massive paw. The device skittered across the forest floor, disappearing into a thick patch of undergrowth. "Well, that's just great," Tom said to himself, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "Guess I'll just wait up here until you get bored and wander off, huh, big guy?" The bear, of course, didn't respond. It continued to circle the tree, occasionally testing the trunk with its claws. Tom could hear its heavy breathing, punctuated by the sound of branches snapping under its weight. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in Tom's leg intensified. He carefully shifted his position to examine the wound, wincing at what he saw. The bear's teeth had torn through his heavy hunting pants and left deep punctures in his calf. Blood seeped steadily from the wounds, and Tom knew he needed to do something to stop the bleeding. With shaking hands, he managed to remove his belt, wrapping it tightly around his leg above the bite. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do until he could get proper medical attention. If he could get proper medical attention, the thought sent a chill through Tom that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. How long would the bear stay interested? Would it eventually give up and wander off, or would it wait him out, knowing it had wounded prey trapped above? And even if the bear did leave, how would Tom get down and make it back to the cabin? His leg was already throbbing with a deep, persistent ache, and he knew the walk back would be long and painful. Hours passed like years as Tom clung to the tree, his injured leg throbbing with each heartbeat. The bear remained below, sometimes circling, sometimes sitting back on its haunches to gaze up at him. Occasionally it would stand and reach up the trunk, its claws scraping bark barely feet from where Tom perched. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became oppressive. Tom's throat was parched, his lips cracked from dehydration. His stomach growled loudly, and he wondered darkly if the bear could hear it too. "You know," Tom said, his voice hoarse, "this really isn't how I planned to spend my vacation. I don't suppose you'd consider calling it a draw and heading home?" The bear tilted its head, almost as if it were considering Tom's words. Then it let out a low growl and swiped at the tree trunk, sending splinters of bark flying. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Tom muttered. As afternoon faded into evening, Tom's situation grew more desperate. The pain in his leg had settled into a constant, throbbing ache, and he could feel the heat of infection setting in. His arms trembled with the effort of holding on, and more than once he caught himself starting to drift off, jerking awake with a panicked gasp. The bear showed no signs of losing interest. If anything, it seemed more determined as the hours passed, perhaps sensing Tom's weakening state. It paced restlessly around the base of the tree, occasionally testing its climbing abilities against the trunk. As night fell once again, the forest came alive with sounds that masked the bear's movements, leaving Tom straining to hear any approach. He fought to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep could mean falling to his death, or worse, into the waiting jaws below. Every rustle in the darkness sent a fresh wave of terror through Tom. His imagination conjured images of the bear silently climbing the tree, its massive form emerging from the shadows right in front of him. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the dark spots dancing at the edges of his vision. "Help," Tom croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somebody, please." But only the indifferent stars answered, twinkling coldly through gaps in the forest canopy. Tom Wilkins, retired firefighter and lifelong outdoorsman, had never felt so alone, so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of nature's brutal indifference. As the long night stretched before him, Tom clung to his precarious perch, caught between the threat below and the unforgiving pull of gravity. All he could do was hold on and pray for dawn, for rescue, for any chance of survival in this wilderness that had suddenly turned so hostile. The hunt had become a nightmare, and Tom was trapped in the middle of it with no end in sight. The second night in the tree passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion for Tom. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the leaves, he was barely conscious, his grip on the branch weakening with each passing moment. Below, the bear had grown restless. It paced around the tree, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to swipe at the trunk. Each impact sent vibrations through the tree, jarring Tom's aching body. "Just go away," Tom mumbled, his voice cracked and barely audible. "Please." But the bear showed no signs of leaving. If anything, it seemed more determined than ever. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows through the canopy, the bear began to circle the tree more urgently. Tom's foggy mind struggled to make sense of the animal's behavior. Was it getting frustrated? Or was it? The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. The bear wasn't giving up. It was preparing to climb. "No," Tom whispered, panic cutting through his exhaustion. "No, no, no." He tried to pull himself higher, but his arms refused to cooperate. The branch he clung to suddenly seemed terrifyingly thin and fragile. Tom looked down, trying to gauge how far he'd have to climb to stay out of the bear's reach. That's when he saw it. The bear had managed to hook its front paws over a low branch, using its powerful muscles to haul itself up off the ground. "Hey!" Tom shouted, his voice hoarse but loud in the stillness of the forest. "Get down! Get out of here!" The bear paused, looking up at Tom with those dark, inscrutable eyes. For a moment, Tom thought his shouts might have worked, but then the animal let out a low growl and continued its ascent. Tom's heart raced as he watched the bear navigate the lower branches with surprising agility for such a large creature. It was slower than Tom had been, clumsier, but it was making steady progress upward. Desperation gave Tom a burst of energy. He began to climb higher, ignoring the screaming protests of his muscles and the throbbing pain in his injured leg. Bark scraped against his hands, reopening cuts from his initial climb, but he barely noticed. The bear was faster. As Tom reached for a higher branch, he felt something grab his dangling foot. A searing pain shot through his leg as the bear's jaws clamped down, nearly pulling him from his perch. Tom let out an involuntary scream of agony, tasting blood as he bit his lip. The coppery tang filled his mouth, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. "Let go!" he yelled, kicking out blindly with his free foot. "Let go, damn you!" His boot connected with something solid, the bear's snout perhaps, and he felt the pressure on his leg lessen slightly. But the animal didn't fully release its grip. Instead, it seemed to be trying to use Tom's leg to pull itself higher. The branch creaked ominously under their combined weight. Tom could feel it bending, the wood fibers straining to their limit. He knew that in moments it would snap, sending both him and the bear plummeting to the ground. In that instant, survival instinct took over. Tom reached for his hunting knife, still miraculously secured in its sheath on his belt. With a trembling hand, he unclasped the sheath and pulled out the blade. "I'm sorry," he gasped, though whether he was apologizing to the bear or to himself, he wasn't sure. Tom plunged the knife downward, aiming for the bear's face. The blade connected with something solid, and the bear let out a roar of pain and surprise. Its jaws opened reflexively, releasing Tom's leg. Without the bear's weight pulling him down, Tom was able to haul himself up to a higher, sturdier branch. He clung there, gasping for breath, as the bear retreated back down the tree. When Tom finally gathered the courage to look down, he saw the bear pacing at the base of the tree. A dark stain matted the fur around its right eye, where Tom's desperate strike had connected. "That's right," Tom called down, his voice shaky but defiant. "Not such easy prey after all, am I?" The bear looked up at him, and Tom could have sworn he saw something like respect in its eyes, or maybe it was just pain and anger. Either way, the animal seemed to have lost its appetite for climbing. As the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade, the pain in Tom's leg reasserted itself with a vengeance. He looked down at the damage, wincing at what he saw. The bear's second bite had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving a ragged wound that bled freely. Tom knew he needed to stop the bleeding. But with what? He had already used his belt as a makeshift tourniquet higher up on his leg. Then he remembered his shirt. With shaking hands, Tom managed to pull off his outer layer, a heavy flannel shirt that had been a gift from his wife last Christmas. "Sorry, Ruth," he muttered as he began to tear the fabric into strips. Binding the wound was an agonizing process. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his leg, and more than once Tom had to pause, breathing deeply to fight off waves of nausea and dizziness. Finally, he managed to secure a tight bandage around the worst of the damage. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't sterile, but it would have to do. The immediate crisis dealt with, Tom allowed himself a moment to assess his situation. He was higher in the tree now, on a sturdier branch that could better support his weight. But he was also further from the ground, making any potential escape or rescue more difficult. The bear still circled below, but its movements seemed less purposeful now. It would occasionally look up at Tom, but it made no further attempts to climb. As the day wore on, Tom drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain in his leg had settled into a constant, throbbing ache, punctuated by sharp spikes whenever he moved. Thirst clawed at his throat, and hunger gnawed at his belly. In his more lucid moments, Tom tried to plan. He knew he couldn't stay in the tree forever. Eventually, he would become too weak to hold on, or the bear would make another attempt. But how could he get down with his injured leg? And even if he did manage to reach the ground, how would he outrun or fight off the bear in his weakened state? The sound of a branch snapping jolted Tom back to full alertness. He looked down, expecting to see the bear making another attempt at the tree. Instead, he saw the animal moving away from him, towards the edge of the clearing. For a moment, hope flared in Tom's chest. Was the bear finally giving up? But then he heard what had caught the bear's attention. A rustling in the underbrush, followed by a familiar voice calling out, "Tom? Tom? You out here?" It was Mike. Terror gripped Tom's heart. His friend had no idea of the danger he was walking into. "Mike!" Tom tried to shout, but his parched throat produced only a hoarse whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Mike, stop, bear!" But his warnings were lost in the ambient sounds of the forest. Tom watched in helpless horror as Mike emerged from the tree line, a look of concern on his weathered face. "Tom, what the hell are you doing up there? I've been looking all over for—" Mike's words cut off abruptly as he spotted the bear. The massive animal had turned to face the newcomer, rising up on its hind legs to its full, terrifying height. "Oh shit," Mike breathed, his hand moving slowly towards the rifle slung over his shoulder. The bear dropped back to all fours and charged. Tom could only watch, his voice frozen in his throat, as his friend's life hung in the balance. The peaceful hunting trip had turned into a nightmare, and it wasn't over yet. The attack, it seemed, had only just begun. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Tom watched the bear charge towards Mike. His friend stood frozen for a split second, eyes wide with shock, before his years of hunting experience kicked in. In one fluid motion, Mike unslung his rifle and brought it to his shoulder. "Mike, no!" Tom croaked, his voice barely audible. He knew that shooting the bear might only enrage it further, and Mike only had one shot before the animal was on him. Whether by luck or skill, Mike's aim was true. The crack of the rifle echoed through the clearing and the bear stumbled, roaring in pain and anger. It veered off its direct course towards Mike, crashing into the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. "Tom!" Mike shouted, his eyes darting between his friend and the tree and the spot where the bear had disappeared. "What the hell is going on?" "Bear, attacked," Tom managed to gasp out. "Been stuck here." Mike's face paled as he took in Tom's battered appearance and the makeshift bandage on his leg. "Jesus, Tom, we need to get you down from there and to a hospital." "No," Tom said, summoning what little strength he had left. "Bear's still out there. Wounded now. More dangerous." As if to emphasize his point, a pained growl emanated from the thick foliage where the bear had vanished. Mike's grip tightened on his rifle. Okay, Mike said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Let me call for help. We'll get a rescue team out here." But as Mike reached for his radio, Tom's heart sank. "Won't work," he said. "No signal out here. Tried. My radio. Bear got it." Mike swore under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "All right, new plan. I'll go back, get help. You just hang on, okay?" Tom wanted to argue, to tell Mike it was too dangerous to go back alone with a wounded bear on the loose. But he knew his friend was right. It was their only chance. "Be careful," Tom managed to say. "Bear's smart. Dangerous." Mike nodded grimly. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Just hold on, buddy." With a final glance at the spot where the bear had disappeared, Mike turned and quickly made his way back into the forest, soon disappearing from view. And then Tom was alone again. Hours passed like years as Tom clung to the tree, his injured leg throbbing with each heartbeat. The forest around him seemed unnaturally quiet, as if all the creatures were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The bear circled below, its movements now punctuated by pained grunts. Tom could see a dark stain spreading through its fur where Mike's bullet had struck. The wound didn't seem to have slowed the animal much, but it had certainly made it angrier. Every so often, the bear would stand on its hind legs, peering up at Tom with curious, hungry eyes. Tom found himself wondering if the animal was evaluating him, trying to decide if he was worth the effort of another climb. "Just go away," Tom muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's plenty of food in the forest. Why are you so fixated on me?" The bear, of course, didn't respond. It just continued its restless pacing, occasionally pawing at its wounded side. As the day wore on, the pain in Tom's leg intensified. He could feel heat radiating from the wound, a sure sign of infection setting in. His head swam with fever, and more than once he caught himself starting to drift off, jerking awake with a panicked gasp. The cold seeped into his bones as night began to fall and Tom fought to stay awake. He knew that falling asleep could mean falling to his death, or worse, into the waiting jaws below. "Stay awake, Tommy," he muttered to himself, using his childhood nickname. "Mike's coming back, help's coming, just gotta stay awake." But as the hours crawled by, doubt began to creep in. What if Mike had run into the bear on his way back? What if he'd gotten lost in the dark? What if help wasn't coming at all? Tom shook his head, trying to dispel the negative thoughts. "No," he said aloud, his voice startling in the quiet forest. "Mike's fine. He's coming back. Just gotta hold on." The night seemed endless. Every rustle in the darkness sent a fresh wave of terror through Tom, imagining the bear making another attempt at the tree. He strained his ears, trying to distinguish between the normal sounds of the forest and the potential approach of the predator below. At some point, Tom wasn't sure if it was midnight or dawn, his sense of time completely skewed. He heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable scrape of claws on bark. Tom looked down, his eyes straining in the dim light. The bear was back at the base of the tree and it was trying to climb again. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, panic giving him a burst of adrenaline. He tried to pull himself higher, but his weakened arms refused to cooperate. The bear's ascent was slow, hampered by its wound. But it was making steady progress, each scrape of its claws bringing it closer to Tom's precarious perch. Tom's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. His knife was long gone, lost in the chaos of the previous attack. He had no weapon, no means of defense. As the bear drew nearer, Tom did the only thing he could think of. He began to shout, "Hey, get out of here, go on, get!" His voice, hoarse from thirst and disuse, seemed pathetically weak in the vast silence of the forest. But he kept at it, yelling and making as much noise as he could. Whether it was the noise or the bear's own exhaustion, the animal's climb slowed. It paused, looking up at Tom with what almost seemed like frustration. Then, to Tom's immense relief, it began to back down the tree. As the bear's bulk disappeared into the shadows at the base of the tree, Tom let out a shaky breath. He'd bought himself some time, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every sound made Tom flinch, expecting to see the bear's massive form emerging from the darkness, but the animal seemed to have given up its climbing attempts, at least for now. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the leaves, Tom allowed himself a moment of hope. He'd made it through another night. Surely help would come soon. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, that hope began to fade. There was no sign of Mike, no sound of approaching rescuers, just the endless, indifferent forest and the patient predator waiting below. Tom's thoughts turned to his wife, Ruth, waiting for him back home in Albany. What would she do if he never came back? Would they ever find out what had happened to him? "I'm sorry, Ruth," he whispered, a tear sliding down his grimy cheek. "I'm so sorry." The bear, seeming to sense his weakening state, had resumed its vigil at the base of the tree. It sat on its haunches, gazing up at Tom with an almost contemplative expression. As the day wore on, Tom found himself slipping in and out of consciousness. The pain in his leg had become a constant throbbing presence, and he could feel the heat of fever burning through his body. In his more lucid moments, he tried to plan, to think of some way out of this nightmare, but each idea seemed more impossible than the last. He was too weak to climb down, let alone outrun the bear. His shouts for help had gone unanswered, and with each passing hour, his strength ebbed away a little more. As night fell once again, Tom clung to his branch, caught between the threat below and the unforgiving pull of gravity. The forest came alive with night sounds, masking any approach of the bear. Every rustle, every snapped twig sent a jolt of terror through Tom. His imagination conjured images of the bear silently climbing the tree, its massive form emerging from the shadows right in front of him. "Help," Tom croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somebody, please." But only the indifferent stars answered, twinkling coldly through gaps in the forest canopy. Tom Wilkins, retired firefighter and lifelong outdoorsman, had never felt so alone, so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of nature's brutal indifference. As the long night stretched before him, Tom clung to his precarious perch, fighting to stay awake, to stay alive. The waiting game continued with no end in sight. The pre-dawn forest was shrouded in a thick mist, turning the world into a gray, formless void. Tom Wilkins, barely clinging to consciousness, couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. The line between reality and fevered dreams had blurred hours ago. In his delirium, Tom thought he heard voices calling his name. He dismissed it as another hallucination, like the conversations he'd been having with Ruth all night. Tom, can you hear me?" The voice seemed more insistent this time, more real. Tom forced his eyes open, blinking away the grit that had accumulated after days without sleep. A faint light cut through the mist, a beam from a flashlight, sweeping across the forest floor. Tom's heart leapt into his throat. Was it real? Or just another cruel trick of his exhausted mind? "Hey, here," Tom tried to call out, but his parched throat produced only a faint whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm here." The beam of light swung upward, momentarily blinding Tom. He heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a familiar voice. "Jesus Christ, Tom, what the hell happened?" It was Mike. Tom felt tears of relief spring to his eyes. "Mike," he croaked, "you came back." "Of course I came back, you stubborn old goat," Mike said, his gruff tone belying the concern in his voice. "Brought help too. Just hang on. We're gonna get you down." As Tom's eyes adjusted, he could make out other figures moving through the mist. Park rangers, he realized, their uniforms a welcome sight after days of isolation. "Mr. Wilkins," one of the rangers called up. "I'm Ranger Sarah Collins. We're here to help. Are you injured?" Tom almost laughed at the question. Was he injured? He felt like one giant throbbing wound. "Leg," he managed to say. "Bear bit me, twice." He heard murmured conversations below, then the sound of equipment being unpacked. "All right, Mr. Wilkins," Ranger Collins called up. "We're going to send someone up to secure you, then we'll lower you down. Just hold on a little longer, okay?" Tom nodded, then realized they probably couldn't see the gesture in the dim light. "Okay," he said. As he watched a young ranger begin to ascend the tree, a sudden thought struck Tom. "Wait," he called out, his voice stronger now with renewed fear. "The bear. It's still out there. Dangerous." "It's okay, Mr. Wilkins," Ranger Collins assured him. "We've been tracking the bear since we got the call. It moved off to the north about an hour ago. You're safe now." Tom sagged against the tree trunk, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. Safe. He was safe. The young ranger reached Tom's position, his face etched with concern as he took in Tom's battered state. "Hi there, Mr. Wilkins. I'm Ranger Dave. Let's get you out of this tree, huh?" Tom nodded wearily. He barely felt the harness being secured around him, his mind drifting as the ranger worked. "Okay, we're ready down here," Ranger Collins called up. "Mr. Wilkins, we're going to lower you now. It might be a bit uncomfortable, but try to stay as still as possible. All right?" "Got it," Tom mumbled. As they began to lower him, the movement sent fresh waves of pain through Tom's injured leg. He bit back a groan, not wanting to worry Mike or the Rangers any more than they already were. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tom felt solid ground beneath him. Gentle hands helped him out of the harness and onto a waiting stretcher. Tom, can you hear me?" Mike's worried face swam into view above him. Tom managed a weak smile. "Hey, Mike. Thanks for coming back." Mike's eyes were suspiciously bright in the growing dawn light. "Don't mention it, buddy. That's what friends are for, right?" As the Rangers prepared to move him, Tom suddenly remembered something. "Mike," he said, grabbing his friend's arm. "My rifle and the deer stand. Can't leave them." Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "Only you would be worried about your gear after all this. Don't worry, I'll come back for it once we get you to the hospital." Tom nodded, allowing himself to relax onto the stretcher. As they began to move through the forest, he found himself drifting in and out of consciousness, the voices of the rescue team fading in and out like a badly tuned radio. Severe lacerations to the right leg. Signs of infection. Possible fracture. Lucky to be alive. That last bit caught Tom's attention. Lucky to be alive. It was true, he realized. By all rights, he should be dead. Killed by the fall or the bear or exposure. Yet here he was, battered and broken, but alive. The journey back to civilization was a blur of jostling movement and concerned voices. Tom was vaguely aware of being loaded into a helicopter, the thrum of the rotors vibrating through his aching body. It wasn't until they reached the hospital that Tom fully came back to himself. The bright lights and antiseptic smell were a shock after days in the forest. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him asking questions, checking vitals, cleaning wounds. "Mr. Wilkins," a doctor said, leaning into his field of view. "I'm Dr. Patel. You're at Albany Medical Center. We're going to take good care of you." "All right." Tom nodded, too exhausted to speak. As they wheeled him toward surgery, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the hallway. "Ruth," he whispered. His wife's face was pale with worry, her eyes red from crying. But when she saw Tom, a smile broke through like sunshine after a storm. "Oh, Tom," she said, hurrying to his side. "I was so worried. When Mike called and said you were missing." "I'm sorry," Tom said, reaching for her hand. "Didn't mean to scare you." Ruth squeezed his hand, her touch grounding him in a way nothing else could. "You're here now. That's all that matters." As they reached the doors to the operating room, Ruth reluctantly let go of Tom's hand. "I'll be right here waiting," she promised. Tom nodded, suddenly feeling very small and vulnerable. As the anesthesia began to take effect, he found himself thinking of the bear. Where was it now? Would it remember him? Would he ever forget it? The last thing Tom saw before darkness claimed him was Ruth's face, worry and love etched in equal measure across her familiar features. Then he was falling into a sleep deeper than any he'd known in that tree, with no bears to trouble his dreams. The ordeal in the forest was over, but Tom Wilkins's journey was far from finished. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room slowly came into focus as Tom Wilkins blinked away the fog of anesthesia. For a moment, disorientation gripped him. Where was he? Why wasn't he in the tree? Then reality crashed back, bringing with it a dull ache that seemed to permeate his entire body. "Tom, honey, can you hear me?" Ruth's voice, warm and comforting, cut through the haze. Tom turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement to see his wife sitting beside the bed, her hand gently clasping his. "Ruth," he managed to croak, his throat dry and scratchy. "Water?" Ruth quickly reached for a cup with a straw, holding it to Tom's lips. The cool liquid was a blessed relief, soothing his parched throat. "How long?" Tom asked after a few sips. "You've been out for about 18 hours, Ruth replied, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "The surgery went well, but you had us worried for a while there." Before Tom could respond, the door opened and Dr. Patel walked in, clipboard in hand. "Ah, Mr. Wilkins, good to see you awake," the doctor said, moving to the foot of the bed. "How are you feeling?" Tom considered the question. How was he feeling? Sore, certainly. Tired, despite having just woken up. And there was something else. A lingering sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly," Tom finally answered, attempting a weak smile. Dr. Patel nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "Well, considering what you've been through, that's to be expected. You've got some severe lacerations on your right leg where the bear bit you. We've cleaned and stitched those up, but you'll need to be careful to avoid infection. There's also a hairline fracture in your left ankle, likely from the climbing. We've put a cast on that." Tom nodded, trying to absorb the information. He glanced down at his body, noticing for the first time the bulky bandages on his leg and the cast peeking out from under the hospital blanket. "When can I go home?" Tom asked. Dr. Patel's expression turned serious. "We'd like to keep you here for at least another day or two, Mr. Wilkins. We need to monitor those wounds for infection, and frankly, you're still quite weak from the ordeal. Rest is the best thing for you right now." Tom wanted to argue, to insist that he was fine, but the bone-deep exhaustion that weighed on him suggested otherwise. He nodded reluctantly. "Now," Dr. Patel continued, "I understand a game warden wants to speak with you about the incident. Do you feel up to that, or would you like to rest first?" Tom's brow furrowed. "Game warden, why?" Ruth squeezed his hand gently. "It's standard procedure, honey. Anytime there's a wild animal attack, they need to file a report." Tom nodded slowly. "Might as well get it over with," he said. Dr. Patel excused himself, and a few minutes later, a tall, lean man in a forest green uniform entered the room. "Mr. Wilkins, I'm Warden Jack Thornton. Mind if I ask you a few questions about what happened out there?" Tom nodded, and the warden pulled up a chair, flipping open a small notebook. Why don't you start from the beginning? Thornton suggested. Tom took a deep breath and began recounting the events. As he spoke, the memories came flooding back with vivid clarity. The initial sighting of the bear, the terror of the first attack, the long, agonizing wait in the tree. And you're certain it was a black bear? Thornton interrupted at one point. Tom nodded emphatically. Biggest damn black bear I've ever seen. Must have been at least 400 pounds. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of skepticism crossing his face. That would be unusually large for a black bear in this region. Tom felt a flash of irritation. I know what I saw, he said firmly. I've been hunting these woods for 30 years. It was a black bear, and it was huge. The warden made a non-committal noise, jotting something in his notebook. And you say your friend Mike shot the bear? That's right, Tom confirmed. Hit it too. Bear ran off into the brush. Thornton's pen paused over the paper. Mr. Wilkins, we've had teams searching the area since your rescue. We found no sign of a wounded bear, no blood trail, nothing to corroborate this part of your story. Tom's fist clenched in frustration, causing Ruth to look at him in concern. Are you saying you don't believe me? He demanded. Thornton held up a placating hand. I'm not saying that at all, Mr. Wilkins. I'm just trying to get all the facts straight. Bear attacks are rare in this area, and we need to be thorough in our investigation. Tom fell silent, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. He knew what he had experienced, but faced with the warden's skepticism, a seed of doubt began to creep in. Had the fear and exhaustion played tricks on his mind? Had the bear really been as big as he remembered? As if sensing his distress, Ruth spoke up. I think that's enough for now, she said firmly. My husband needs to rest. Thornton nodded, closing his notebook. Of course, thank you for your time. Thank you for Mr. Wilkins. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to contact our office. After the warden left, Tom lay back against his pillows, his mind churning. Ruth stroked his arm soothingly. Don't let it bother you, honey, she said softly. You've been through a terrible ordeal. It's natural for some of the details to be a bit fuzzy. Tom nodded, but the unease persisted. He knew what he had experienced, didn't he? The memory of the bear's gleaming teeth and glowing eyes in the darkness seemed so vivid, so real. But now, in the harsh light of the hospital room, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, it all seemed like a distant nightmare. That night, Tom's dreams were haunted by gleaming teeth and glowing eyes. He jolted awake several times, his heart racing, the phantom sensation of claws tearing at his flesh causing him to cry out. Each time, Ruth was there, her gentle touch and soothing words anchoring him back to reality. But even in his waking hours, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The next day, as Dr. Patel changed the dressings on Tom's leg, the extent of his injuries became clear. The bear's teeth had left deep, ragged wounds that would undoubtedly scar. These are healing nicely, Dr. Patel commented as he applied fresh bandages. But I'm a bit concerned about this area here. It seems to be showing signs of infection. Tom winced as the doctor probed the tender flesh. The pain was a constant reminder of his ordeal, making it impossible to dismiss as just a bad dream. We'll start you on a stronger course of antibiotics, Doctor, Patel decided. And I'd like to keep you here another day or two for observation. Tom nodded resignedly. As much as he wanted to go home, to put this whole experience behind him, a part of him was relieved. Here in the hospital, with its sterile walls and constant monitoring, he felt safe. The thought of returning to his home near the woods filled him with a dread he was ashamed to admit. As the days passed, Tom found himself reliving the attack over and over. The stitches in his leg itched incessantly, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous shape. Every unexpected sound made him flinch. Ruth noticed his jumpiness, the way his eyes constantly darted to the windows and doors. It's okay, Tom, she would say, squeezing his hand. You're safe now. But Tom wasn't sure he'd ever feel truly safe again. The bear had taken more than just flesh when it attacked him. It had taken his sense of security, his confidence in his ability to handle whatever nature might throw at him. As he lay in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling, Tom Wilkins wondered if he would ever be the same man who had ventured into those woods just a few days ago. The physical wounds would heal, leaving scars as a testament to his survival. But the psychological scars, invisible yet just as real, might take far longer to fade. The aftermath of the attack was proving to be a battle all its own, and Tom wasn't sure if he was winning or losing. Weeks had passed since Tom Wilkins's harrowing encounter with the black bear in the Adirondacks. The physical wounds were healing, the stitches removed, leaving angry red scars that stood out starkly against his skin. But the psychological scars ran deeper, invisible to the eye yet painfully present in Tom's mind. As Tom stood at the edge of the forest near his home, his healed leg aching with a phantom pain, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The familiar tree line that had once represented adventure and solace now loomed before him like an impenetrable wall of potential danger. "You don't have to do this, you know," Ruth said softly, standing beside him. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. "No one would think less of you if you decided to hang up your hunting gear for good." Tom shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "I have to, Ruth. If I don't face this now, I never will. That bear, it can't win. I won't let it take this from me too." Ruth nodded, understanding in her eyes. "All right, but promise me you'll be careful. And keep your satellite phone on you at all times." "I promise," Tom said, leaning over to kiss her cheek. "I'll be back before dark." With a deep breath, Tom took his first step into the forest. The crunch of leaves under his boots seemed unnaturally loud, and he found himself gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every rustle of leaves sent his heart racing, and he found himself constantly scanning his surroundings, half expecting to see a massive black shape lunging out from behind every tree. The forest that had once been a second home now felt alien and hostile. As he approached the site of the attack, Tom's steps slowed. He could see the tree where he had spent those terrifying days and nights, its bark still bearing the scars of the bear's claws. The sight sent a shudder through him, memories flooding back with vivid clarity. Tom forced himself to approach the tree, his hand reaching out to touch the gouges in the bark. They seemed impossibly high, and for a moment he wondered if the warden's skepticism had been justified. Had fear really made the bear seem larger than it was? But then his fingers found a deeper gouge, higher up the trunk, and he remembered. This was where the bear had nearly pulled him from his perch, its powerful jaws clamping down on his leg. The memory was too visceral, too painful to be a product of an overactive imagination. It was real, Tom muttered to himself. Every bit of it was real. As he turned away from the tree, a dark shape in his peripheral vision made him stumble backward, his rifle coming up instinctively. But it was just a fallen log, half hidden in the underbrush. Tom let out a shaky breath, lowering his weapon. "Get a grip, old man," he chided himself. "You can't jump at every shadow for the rest of your life." Determined to reclaim some sense of normalcy, Tom decided to check on his old deer stand. As he made his way through the familiar trails, he found himself relaxing slightly. The rhythms of the forest, the chirping of birds, the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves, it all began to feel familiar again. But as he neared the clearing where his stand was located, that uneasy feeling returned full force. Tom's steps slowed, his eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of danger. He could smell it again. That musky, wild odor that had heralded the bear's arrival all those weeks ago. "It's just your imagination," Tom told himself firmly. The bear is long gone, probably miles away by now. Still, he approached the clearing with caution, his rifle at the ready. As he emerged from the tree line, his eyes immediately went to his deer stand. It was still there, seemingly untouched since that fateful day. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Everything was fine, normal, just as he'd left it. But then he saw the claw marks, deep gouges in the base of the tree, fresh enough that sap still oozed from some of them. Tom's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The bear had been here recently. Very recently. His hands shaking, Tom raised his rifle, scanning the edges of the clearing. The forest suddenly seemed too quiet, as if holding its breath. He could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. and Tom whirled, his finger tightening on the trigger. But there was nothing there, just more trees and undergrowth. "Hello?" Tom called out, immediately regretting the sound of his voice breaking the silence. "Anyone there?" Only the faint echo of his own words answered him. Tom backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the tree line. The urge to run was almost overwhelming, but he forced himself to move calmly, deliberately. Running would only trigger a predator's chase instinct. As he reached the opposite side of the clearing, Tom allowed himself one last look at his deer stand. In that moment, he saw it, a large, dark shape moving through the trees at the far end of the clearing. It was gone in an instant, so quick Tom wasn't sure if he'd really seen it, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But the fear that gripped him was real enough. Tom turned and hurried back down the trail, no longer caring about stealth or dignity. He just wanted to get out of the forest, to get back to the safety of home and Ruth's comforting presence. By the time he emerged from the tree line near his house, Tom was breathless and sweating, his healed leg aching fiercely. Ruth was there in an instant, concern etched on her face. "Tom, what happened? Are you all right?" Tom nodded, trying to catch his breath. "I'm fine," he managed to say. "Just got spooked, I guess." Ruth led him inside, sitting him down at the kitchen table and pressing a glass of water into his hands. As Tom's breathing steadied, he recounted what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, in the clearing. "Maybe it was just a deer," Ruth suggested gently, "or your mind playing tricks on you. It's understandable after what you've been through." Tom wanted to believe her. Part of him knew she was probably right, but the memory of those fresh claw marks, the fleeting glimpse of that dark shape, felt too real to dismiss. "Maybe," he said, not wanting to worry her further. "You're probably right." But as the day wore on, Tom found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the edge of the forest. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves in the breeze made him tense. That night, as he lay in bed, Tom made a decision. He couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows and imagining dangers lurking behind every tree. He needed to face this fear head-on, to prove to himself once and for all that he was still master of his own fate. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go back into the forest. He would find proof of the bear's presence or proof of its absence. Either way, he would face the truth, whatever it might be. As Tom drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with dark forests and gleaming eyes. But this time, instead of running, he stood his ground. In his dreams, at least, Tom Wilkins was no longer prey. The return to the forest had been a trial, but Tom knew it was just the beginning. The real test would come with the dawn, when he would venture back into the woods to confront his fears once and for all. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated Tom's face as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. It was late, the house quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of settling wood. Tom had been sitting there for hours trying to find the right words to share his experience. Finally, with a deep breath, he began to type, "Fellow hunters and outdoor enthusiasts, I want to share a story with you, a warning about the dangers that can lurk in our beloved forests. 2 weeks ago, I had an encounter with a black bear in the Adirondacks that nearly cost me my life." Tom paused, his hands shaking slightly as he recalled the events. He forced himself to continue, detailing the initial sighting, the terrifying attack, the long days trapped in the tree, and his eventual rescue. As he wrote, he could almost feel the bark under his hands, smell the musty odor of the bear, hear its growls echoing through the forest. When he finally finished, Tom sat back, exhaling slowly. His finger hovered over the post button on the local hunting forum. Part of him worried about the reception his story would receive. Would they believe him? Or would they, like the game warden, question the details of his account? "You okay, honey?" Ruth's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway of his study, a concerned look on her face. Tom nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, just sharing my story on the forum, hoping it might help someone else avoid what happened to me." Ruth came over, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder as she read through the post. "It's a powerful story, Tom. I think it's important that you share it." With a nod of determination, Tom clicked post. The deed was done. Over the next few days, Tom found himself constantly checking the forum for responses. The reactions were mixed, just as he'd feared. Wow, what a harrowing experience. Glad you made it out okay, Tom. A 400-pound black bear? In the Adirondacks? Sorry, but I'm calling bull on this one. Sounds like someone had a few too many beers around the campfire. Thanks for sharing, Tom. It's a good reminder to always be prepared when we're out there. The skeptical comments stung, making Tom question whether he should have shared his experience at all. But for every doubter, there was someone who took his warning seriously, and that made it worthwhile. A week after posting his story, Tom stood in the garage, methodically checking and packing his hunting gear. The familiar routine was comforting, but he couldn't shake the undercurrent of anxiety that now accompanied his preparations. Ruth leaned against the door frame, watching him with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're really going back out there, aren't you?" Tom nodded, not looking up from his task. "Have to, Ruth. Can't let fear rule my life." "I know," she said softly. "Just promise me you'll be extra careful and take the satellite phone?" "Already packed," Tom assured her, patting one of the pockets on his vest. "And I've added a few new items to my kit." He held up a can of bear spray, then pointed to a small air horn attached to his backpack. "Not taking any chances this time." Ruth nodded, a small smile on her lips. "My cautious hunter." Who would have thought? The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Perfect weather for hunting. As Tom stepped out of his truck at the trailhead, he took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The forest stretched out before him, a tapestry of autumn colors. For a moment, the old excitement returned, the thrill of the hunt that had drawn him to these woods for decades. But as he took his first steps down the trail, that familiar unease crept in. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent his heart racing. Tom forced himself to breathe steadily, consciously relaxing his death grip on his rifle. "You're okay," he muttered to himself. "You're prepared. Nothing's going to catch you off guard this time." As he hiked deeper into the forest, Tom found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings. He noted every game trail, every potential hiding spot, in a way he never had before. It was exhausting, but he couldn't seem to turn it off. Finally, Tom reached the clearing where he planned to set up his new tree stand. It was a different spot from his old one, farther from the site of the attack. As he began to secure the stand to a sturdy oak, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Tom froze, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the tree line. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive black shape. For a heart-stopping moment, Tom was sure it was the bear, come back to finish what it had started. But as his eyes focused, he realized it was just a fallen log, its bark darkened by recent rains. Tom let out a shaky laugh, the tension draining from his body. "Get a grip, old man," he chided himself. "You can't jump at every shadow for the rest of your life." With renewed determination, Tom finished setting up his stand and climbed up to test it. As he settled into the familiar perch, he found himself relaxing for the first time since he'd entered the forest. The day passed slowly, with no sign of deer or any other large animals. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Tom prepared to pack up and head home. That's when he saw it. A large, dark shape moving through the trees at the far end of the clearing. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he raised his binoculars. For a brief moment, he locked eyes with a massive black bear. It was eerily similar to the one that had attacked him, its bulk unmistakable even at this distance. The bear regarded him for a long moment, then turned and lumbered back into the dense forest. Tom sat frozen in his stand, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to scramble down and run all the way back to his truck, but another part, a stronger part, kept him rooted in place. He had seen the bear, faced his fear, and survived. The forest hadn't changed. It had always been a place of both beauty and danger, but Tom had changed. He was more cautious now, more aware, but also more resilient. As he finally climbed down from his stand and began the hike back to his truck, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. The forest would never again be the carefree playground of his younger days, but it was still his place, still a part of him. That night, As Tom recounted his day to Ruth over dinner, he found himself smiling. "You know," he said, "I think I'm going to be okay out there." Ruth reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I know you will be, honey. You're too stubborn to let a bear scare you away from what you love." Tom chuckled, nodding. "You've got that right." As he lay in bed that night, Tom reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. The attack had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront his own mortality and the unpredictable nature of the wilderness he loved. But it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger, more respectful of the forest and its inhabitants. He would never again take his safety for granted, never assume that his years of experience made him invulnerable. This was his new normal, a life where caution and preparation went hand in hand with his love for the outdoors. As Tom drifted off to sleep, he felt at peace with this new reality. The bear had changed him, yes, but it hadn't defeated him. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to step into the forest. And Tom Wilkins would be ready, both for the challenges and the joys that awaited him there.